Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jo Davich with the Georgia Center for the Book. And again, we welcome you to Revival Lost Southern Voices. Just a few notes before we begin our presentation this afternoon. Don't forget, if you would like to participate in the raffle, please change your name to your full first and last name so we can see that on screen. And that way we will get you registered for the raffle. We will pick the name this afternoon, but we will inform you and try and contact you about picking up those books later next week. We'd also like to remind you that in the chat section, we will have links to books from a local bookseller. Today's bookseller is Acapella Books, an independent bookstore here in Atlanta, Georgia. So we encourage you to support them and purchase the titles that are related to today's lecture. If you enjoyed today's lecture, or you would like to watch it again and catch any of the lectures you've missed in the Revival Lost Southern Voices 2022 series, we will post them to the Georgia Center for the Book YouTube channel next week. Right now, I would like to introduce you to the moderator of today's panel. Oh, and a few questions. If you have questions, this is going to be a conversational style of panel. So feel free to chime in by using the Q&A feature. You're going to find the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. So feel free to tap that button and go ahead and type your question in. I also would like to make you aware that we have live transcription enabled for our hearing impaired guests. If you need to modify the font on the live transcription, click the CC button at the top or the bottom of your screen, and you can modify that text there. Jessica Handler is the author of the novel, The Magnetic Girl, winner of the 2020 Southern Book Prize, a nominee for the Townsend Prize for Fiction, and one of the books all Georgians should read, as was her memoir, Invisible Sisters. Her craft guide, Braving the Fire, a guide to writing about grief and loss, was praised by Vanity Fair magazine. She teaches creative writing and directs the minor in writing at Oglethorpe University here in Atlanta and lectures internationally on writing. You can find out more about Jessica and all of her awards and her writings at jessicahandler.com. So once again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And now I'll turn this over to Jessica. Jessica?
Jo, thank you very much, and welcome everybody, and welcome to our panelists. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, introduce the panelists, and then we will get into a conversation. As you have questions, please post them in the chat, and I will get to them towards the end, and also intermittently throughout. So welcome, and thanks for your participation. Between 1979 and 1981, at least 29 Black children, teens, and young adults, mostly boys, were kidnapped and murdered. The FBI joined the multi-agency investigation in 1980. Wayne Williams has long been considered the main suspect, but he has never been charged in connection with the children's deaths. He was sentenced in 1982 to serve 2 life prison sentences for the murders of 2 adults. So joining us today to talk about It's Never Been Over, generational trauma and the Atlanta child murders are Maurice Hobson, Dr. Calinda Lee, and Vern Smith. So let me introduce you real quickly. Dr. Maurice Hobson is an associate professor of African American Studies and History at Georgia State University. He earned his PhD in history, focusing in African American history and 20th century US history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of the award-winning book, The Legend of the Black Mecca, Politics and Class in the Making of Modern Atlanta, and served as consulting producer and historian for HBO documentaries, Atlanta's Missing and Murdered, The Lost Children. Dr. Calinda Lee, educated at Spelman College, New York University, and Emory University, joined the Center for Civil and Human Rights to head up their substantive program work on education, civic engagement, facilitated conversations, and training experiences for diversity, equity, and inclusion, law enforcement, and advocacy. Dr. Lee previously served as Vice President of Historical Interpretation and Community Engagement for the Atlanta History Center. Vern Smith is an award-winning journalist, author, and screenwriter, and is president of VES Media, a content creation company, that develops and produces documentaries and scripted films. He appeared in the How It Really Happened program on the Atlanta child murders and in the 2019 investigative Discovery 3-part documentary, The Atlanta Child Murders. He is a former Newsweek Atlanta bureau chief and national correspondent. His novel, The Jones Men, is a New York Times recommended book and Mystery Writers of America Edgar Award-winning nominee and has been in print continuously since 1974. For further biographical information, because they are extensive, please refer to the program. So welcome, all three of you, Vern, Maurice, and Calinda. I want to start out by asking you this. How America remembers the Atlanta child murders is, as Dr. Lee has said, bifurcated. Some communities can't forget, and other communities might be surprised or alarmed by that. So what are the ways in which the legacy of this loss is bifurcated or split into? I'll take whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll lean in since you referenced my quote. I think it's at least bifurcated. When I said that, I was referring very specifically to a racialized memory and a race dynamic. And so one of the things I will share with you as I was doing research on this work for public projects, for exhibition and other things, is the extent to which African-American communities, particularly locally, continue to be traumatized and deeply situated within that moment because it has not had resolution in lots of different ways, which I'm sure we'll talk about over the course of this panel. And the extent to which white communities with whom I was speaking often had no recollection of it whatsoever, like didn't know it happened. And people who were contemporary, who were living contemporarily with the events. And I thought, how could this possibly be? This is stunning, even recognizing the persistent racialized segregation or residential segregation and disparate access to information and the ways in which this is handled. This was stunning to me. And so I dug a little bit more deeply into this. And I think that there are two parts to this. One part is really about the extent to which African-American communities at that time, and to some extent continue to be, I'm interested to hear what Vern might think about this, were receiving information about these events in very different ways than white communities were. White community information was very much structured in a law and order discourse, was very much focused around vilifying parents of the victims and victim blaming. And African-American communities were really gathering information about this well before the press even deemed it newsworthy, through a word of mouth system that was deeply situated in understandings about African-American vulnerability and peril that it had existed for generations. So there was a word of mouth passage of information, but let me say this too, at a certain point, a word of mouth campaign to make sure that people understood what was happening and to make sure that people understood that they needed to pass the word and protect themselves. And so that's what I mean in the sense of it being at the time of the killings, right? A bifurcated experience, and then subsequently in memory, that experience being defined by these two very different streams of consciousness. And I will tell you just very quickly also that my perspective is rooted in my work as a scholar, but also really deeply and personally in my experience as a child in Atlanta during that moment.
And we are going to talk about that because I think all three of you were here as young adults and as children, as young adults, and as working adults during that period. So you all have both scholarly responses to this as well as independent individual responses. Vern, do you want to respond to what Calinda said about the way the information was disseminated?
Yeah, I absolutely, and I think she's right in that the case literally bubbled up from inside the community just by coming to the consciousness, even to the local authorities. You know, the cases began really below the radar, accepting within the families. So the first, say in 1979, when mothers of a handful of children who had gone missing and the remains later found, came together to sound the alarm, but before they coalesced as a group of concerned parents. The larger community, even within the larger Black community, had no idea that there was something going on that was unusual in terms of what was happening to Black children.
Right.
And I think as the cases grew, literally as the number of victims increased, you had a wider sense of alarm and concern. And I think initially, even the white communities and even communities outside of Atlanta began to respond to this. At one point, there was a campaign of green ribbons as a way of supporting the victims and their families, and this became a national, even international kind of movement, kind of a way of expressing a concern for what was happening here. But and I think to the point about the gradual disremembering of what happened, I think it happened over time, and I think largely it had to do with the complex way that the case be formed against the one person charged, the way the overall case was ended without resolution to most of the crimes. A number of the reporters covering it at the time, we felt like what is happening would happen because there was going to be this unsatisfactory conclusion to these events, and it was going to linger, especially within the members of Black people, to this day and beyond, just because there were so many unanswered questions at the end of all of this.
The word disremember is that you just said disremembering. It's a really interesting word, considering that we're talking about voices and what we learn. Maurice, do you want to weigh in on this a little bit? Oh, yeah. There you go. Gotcha.
The thing about this too is, most recently, much like Calinda, I am impacted by this not only as a scholar, but with personal experiences and all kinds of different things. And I wrote this book several years ago, The Legend of the Black Mecca, that really deals with the Atlanta child murder in a chapter. Since then, though, I've come into an onslaught of information from the defense attorney, Lynn Watley, 40 years worth of information, to whereas I would rewrite that aspect of the book very differently because I know more information.
Yeah.
And so the thing about the Atlanta child murders is how it plays out publicly. And I do think that it is bifurcated at least bifurcated in some ways, because Black folk have never forgotten about this. And, the fact that, you couldn't ride your bike down the street or you couldn't go trick-or-treating or something like that because the body snatcher was going to get you. I mean, that was very real. And it's still very real to Generation X. But with all of that being said, the ways in which this would play out in public, based on what was taking place on the ground, is something that has left a lot more answers unclear. I want to say this. One of the things that I've noticed with this, and I've done interviews with many of the victims' mothers. We've done mappings of some of the victims that were found. I actually argue that the child murders take place from 75 to 85 and that there are more than 200 victims. So I think it's more expanded than what it is that we know, and that's based on evidence that I have.
Right.
But the thing about this is, the fact that the city leadership deemed these victims as hustlers and runaways. And, the fact that, during this time, Atlanta is really trying to make a move as being the poster child for race relations in the American South.
The city too busy to hate, as I recall.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Well, the city too busy to hate on one side and the Black Mecca on the other.
Yeah.
And it presents this notion that some of the Black political figures may have been more in love with saving the face of the Black Mecca than actually taking care of Black citizens who were gone.
Okay. So that goes to the next question. Thank you very much. I love how it just works so well. You know, let's see, the act of silencing a voice or of losing a voice, I mean, which is kind of what Maurice was talking about, is who's being heard here and who's not being heard. This has multiple meanings, you know, in this context: the children who were killed, the parents who were not heard, and the approach that the politicians, both on the state and the federal level, took. So what are your thoughts on who and what was silenced? And this kind of comes from what Maurice was just saying, the why of this silencing, right? Not so much the who, but the why of the silencing. Anybody care to run with that? Maurice,
well,
go ahead.
I would say that you know, piggybacking on what Maurice said, that
yeah,
you did have these twin competing kind of narratives of what kind of place was this, right? And so on the one hand, you've got the rising sort of center of the new center of Black America, where you know, Black-owned businesses could flourish, and politics, the power of the Black vote was being felt. And so in many ways, from the first election, Maynard Jackson's first election on, you had a sense among much of Black America around the country that Atlanta was the place to be. Atlanta was the place that was showing the way. Mm-hmm. And you know, the growth of Black business which was ascribed to the growth of Black political power, and you know what Maynard Jackson created began to be duplicated in the late 70s around the country. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you had that kind of really almost invincible image of Atlanta, and it became, that is where the beginning, the influx of people from other parts of the country started to come to Atlanta, because Atlanta seemed to be the place where you could make your mark if you were a Black person. That there were some barriers that had been lowered here that hadn't been lowered in other parts of the country. So that was part of it. So when these murders began quietly at first, and then towards the end of the murders that are included on the list of the Atlanta child murder cases, right, you know, where this crescendo, this drumbeat of bodies happened over a short period of time, you know, it sort of shattered that image. And there was a scramble to reclaim it and to continue along the ascendancy of Black economic and political power that the city thought it was on. So right, the notion of this being a very contrarian image of what Atlanta thought of itself was very palpable at the time.
Right. Yeah, Calinda.
You know, I think I agree with all that my colleagues have had to say thus far. I would take it a step farther. I think that, you know, you asked the question before about bifurcation, and we talked about race. Mm-hmm. It's also about class. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, that's the framework that Vern is talking about. There are class distinctions that are strident in terms of how people are talking about, dealing with, and feeling that they are affected by these murders of children. Mm-hmm. And I think that cannot be overstated, because what we're really talking about are victims here who are almost to a one, the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, the most impoverished among the city's population. And that has everything to do, in my opinion, with how these cases were treated, how the parents' voices how it was possible to shunt the parents' voices aside, and how it was possible for African-American led administrations to not feel a certain level of accountability to these victims and to their families. I want to also suggest, as an historian, I'm trained as an historian, that this is actually something that extends well before the Jackson administration, right? Atlanta's sort of power regimes and the ways in which Atlanta negotiated power around Blackness and whiteness, and even this notion to some extent of Atlanta as a Black Mecca, extended well before the early 70s. And so the ways in which African Americans were accessing power, maybe not in the seats of political power as elected officials, but certainly in this kind of back office sort of way of, understanding that, if the mayor wanted to get something done, like we need to talk to Dobbs, we need to talk to, other folks in power, we need to, talk to the various powers that be at Atlanta Life Insurance Company. All of those sorts of things are a really important underpinning of how Black community got developed in Atlanta, and ultimately how Black political power was consolidated in Atlanta, and ultimately the rise of a Black middle class in Atlanta. These victims are not members of the Black middle class. And so it is really important to understand those two things if we're going to understand anything about silencing within this context.
That's a really important point, and I don't know how often that's brought to the forefront. Maurice.
Well, I want to give a little bit more context on why I made the statement earlier. In 1975, Maynard Jackson was approached by a handball player from the Munich Games, the 1972 Munich Games, about Atlanta hosting the Olympics. Basically, what Maynard Jackson does is he calls 16 of the most prominent business entities in Atlanta to meet at Coca-Cola's headquarters. J. Paul Austin convened the meeting, and they voted a resounding no. The reason they voted a resounding no was because of terror that took place in '72 and debt that was impending in Montreal. What was particularly interesting about this during this time as well is that in the state legislature, the Georgia Assembly was so upset with Maynard Jackson and his giving affirmative action to Black contractors that they decided to try to do away with the Atlanta City Charter and to create a Atlanta Fulton governing body. Well, Maynard Jackson, being the legal savant that he was, said that it's according to state constitution that you have to have a 2-year study. And basically what this does is it guarantees that Maynard Jackson will be reelected, because the goal of this Fulton Atlanta initiative was to annex more white suburban areas to be able to kind of oust Maynard. What also takes place during this time is when you have A. Reginald Eves that's put over the police chief.
All right.
I'm setting this up because I want to give you some understanding on why many believe the murders took place. This was done to try to shame Maynard Jackson. And it was done in a particular kind of way. And I can go on and on about this. But
when you say this, you mean the Fulton, Atlanta?
Well, the child murders were one of the things that has been uncovered, and I don't want to get in too deep, but is, some of the murders had distinctive patterns and were associated with Klan activity. And the particular thing about Klan activity was that everyone knew that if you were a Klansman, you could get a job working for Atlanta police. That was one thing. The other thing is that you had Klansmen who also were found with Coca-Cola uniforms, milkman uniforms, and all kinds of things, who could move through Black communities who would not be seen in particular kind of ways. They were killing children who oftentimes would have gone under the radar because, again, they were the most vibrant but vulnerable populations in the city of Atlanta. And so I just wanted to give that context because there is some politics going. I'm one of those persons who argue, I do understand that there are class distinctions in particular ways, but when you live in the American South and you understand segregation and how it works, even de facto or de jure, one of the things about Black America is that they all live amongst each other. They all know each other. I mean, the numbers man knows the preacher who knows the college president, and they interact in some ways. And so the class formation is not as distinctively different as many people would think, but it is very much there. So this piece on class is a very important piece to it.
It's an important part of this. We've got a, thank you for this, y'all. We've got a comment in the comment box, the chat box, which actually takes us to another question. Elena says, I'm shocked that Wayne Williams, she says WW, so I'm going to go with Wayne Williams on that, was convicted only, exclamation point, for the murder of 2 adults. I remember when he was arrested, I could have sworn his arrest, I remember when he was arrested, even in the North, we heaved a sigh of relief, says Elena. So one of the things I want to ask, and this comes to Dr. Hobson and to Mr. Smith, Dr. Hobson, you've written about the Bat Patrol and also the STOP committee, and you can tell us what that acronym is for. And Vern, you've written about Wayne Williams' personality change on the stand, right? So did something go wrong here, or did something, tell us a little bit about how this was policed and how it was adjudicated.
Go for it, Mrs. Smith.
Well, so, the experience of covering the murders at the time was very different, right? So I don't know, because I didn't pursue the case as a reporter much past the end of the trial, right? Mm-hmm. But so I liken what went on to in reference to what the questioner just said,
right? And
I think she's referencing the kind of emotional roller coaster that period of which we're framing the cases that started in '79 and that ended with Wayne Williams' arrest on the bridge. Or his stop on the bridge, right? So mm-hmm. you had from '79 to when the parents first sound the alarm that there's something going on here, and ultimately the Atlanta police formed the task force of missing and murdered children, and now the community is alarmed. You had this sense that something was going on. You didn't know, and the police didn't know exactly what it was, how to frame it, right? So most of '79 through '80, early '80, the police are constantly saying they don't know whether it's a single killer, multiple killers, whether the cases are connected, or we have a multitude of people killing children, right? Mm. And so the community is sort of on this kind of watching, but not really into it the way it ultimately came through most of 1980. We're finding bodies, kids are going missing. The police are still not saying, that we have a serial killer or we have multiple serial killers. They weren't saying that. So mm-hmm. November 1980, Patrick Rogers goes missing. Mm-hmm. And then it's almost as if the killing took a holiday break. So you find Pat Man's body in December, about a month later. And then there are no reports or no bodies found from that point until after the holidays, really. And so then the next victim is in January of '81, right? So now we've gone from '79 to '81, and the incidents have continued, but we are still told that there's no pattern that we can really discern what's going on. So, and then from January 3rd up until May, when Wayne Williams is stopped, by the time we get to April, now there's a very different kind of roller coaster, right? So mm-hmm. 79, 81 is a slow rise like a roller coaster. Now you're at the beginning of 81, and then the rapid descent. And the rapid descent is now bodies and missing bodies. Kids are missing, bodies are found. Kids are missing, bodies are found.
Right.
The emotional roller coaster is ratcheted up tenfold, because now it looks like there is a repeat killer, right? And that they are connected just by the rapidity of the incidents,
Right.
And then at the same time, now we're getting reports that the police believe that these cases are linked, that they're recovering bodies, and there are fibers and dog hairs that they believe are now linking some of these victims, right? The bodies start appearing in bodies of water around Atlanta, right?
Mm-hmm.
The community is now totally terrorized. It's going from like the victims and the communities that she referenced earlier, where you had the lower income residents that were producing these victims. And so, but it's happening so rapidly, and so now the entire community is terrorized. This is at one point in which people who may have felt comfortable that they didn't live in Perry Homes or some of the places where victims were coming from are now like it's affecting them even though they don't live there. I remember interviewing a man who had kids, 10 and 12 sons, and he said he told his sons, don't trust anybody, not even your uncles. Okay, right. So you have you know it's like a breaking point, right? So now you can't turn away from the notion that there's a Jack the Ripper type or sub Jack the Ripper types stalking our city, right? And so what that questioner is alluding to is it's at the moment when you're thinking, my God, how much more can we take, even though we collectively are not people who live in the communities like where the victims are coming from, right? And you're at this point where, oh my God, what next? And then comes Wayne Williams stopped on the bridge that night. And right. So what she's referring to, which is that sense of exhaling that people felt, that happened, that was real. Now, whether or not the kids continued to be snatched and killed, it could well be, but that roller coaster that I'm describing, it seemed to have come down at that point, right?
Right.
And from that point through the trial, you went into a very different kind of emotional feeling. One of the things, and one of the confusing things, is that Williams was convicted of murdering 2 adults, but the prosecution, by use of this prior bad acts doctrine, was able to introduce the children, I think it was 10 cases of children that had been killed during this period. And they linked them as part of a way of trying to prove pattern and bent of mind that would link the cases of these children, not that Wayne Williams was not charged with killing, to the 2 adults that he was charged with killing. And the judge allowed that in. And so during the trial, you had the sense that you do have 2 adults, but then they were able to bring in some of these kids and link them. And that is what happened. But from the actual context of what Wayne Williams was convicted of, right? It was the 2 adults, but they did introduce evidence that linked him to a number of those children that had been killed earlier than the ones that were killed later in late May, following his being stopped on the bridge.
So two questions have come up as a result of this, and I want to roll back a little bit. What were the Bat Patrol and the Stop Committee? Can you let people know who were not present at that time?
I don't mind doing it. The Stop Committee, their official name was the Committee to Stop Children's Murders. It was an organization put together of mothers of the victims who were really calculated in really, keeping their ears to the street and beating the pavement to protect children. When they were formed, I think they had a 10-step plan on what it is that they were willing or trying to do. Interesting thing about the Stop Committee is that once it came up that the Stop Committee was receiving funds from around the nation and the world to support the victims' families, one of the things that Maynard Jackson understood is he doubted that they probably had a 501c3 or 501c4 and able to actually bring the mothers to court. He was
making them a legal entity without the tax ID. Yeah.
And I think they were charged with misuse of public trust and some different things. But basically, it was a way to silence them. The flip side, the Bat Patrol was a group that came out of Techwood Homes, and they were put together by Chimaringa Jinga. The notion was they were in similar ways like the Black Panther Party. And the idea was kind of self-determination, protecting the community and whatnot, because several of the victims that come out of Techwood Homes, one of the victims that Wayne Williams was accused of killing or convicted of killing came out of Techwood Homes. The interesting thing about them is that there were several convicted felons who were members of the Bat Patrol. And once they were caught with guns, what happens is the Bat Patrol was silenced. Right. So on some levels, I'm not saying that this is some kind of vigilante. These were not vigilante groups, but the mothers understood that no one was going to love and protect their children like they were. And the Bat Patrol did not have enough faith in the system to believe that the police would protect Black children. And so that's the Stop Committee and the Bat Patrol.
Okay, good, thank you. Calinda, you looked like you wanted to speak.
I do. I want to reframe a little bit. So I won't be redundant in any way, but I want to say that I think these are really important questions, and it's really important to understand the particularities of what happened in this context. But I feel like there are two stories happening here, and there are two timelines that we can track. And one of them, so we're talking about, Georgia Center for the Book. One of them is a true crime kind of narrative and timeline, and another is a timeline that's really about kind of policy and action. And I think that they certainly run together, but they're not the same, because the context for which and in which these murders occurred, the dissatisfaction with the resolution, I use air quotes intentionally, around them, and this conversation about continued trauma or multi-generational trauma is all about that second timeline. And so, for example, when we talk about, parents sounding the alarm, mothers sounding the alarm, let's be really clear. Mothers sat in on the mayor's office and demanded an investigation be open. That's a very different thing than many other ways that an alarm could be sounded. And now we know that there's a problem and we do something. Maurice has just been talking about silencing groups that were formed to be protective of children. Without understanding that gap, without understanding the policy and the timeline in that context, it might be difficult to understand why would somebody want to silence the families of victims of such heinous crimes. But you have to remember that the public policy response to this were things like the Atlanta Police Department instituted a curfew, right? So for people who would be victims, right? It was enforced in Black communities throughout the city and spaces where Black youth occupied. So like, for example, there was a lot of enforcement around the Omni, where kids would go and hang out. And the children who broke that curfew were detained, as sometimes were their parents. So there was a very real sense of vilification of the people who were victims and would be victims. And the policy responses tended in that arena. So that this atmosphere of distrust, which unsurprisingly led at a minimum to an attitude of skepticism when Wayne Williams was arrested. It was really created within that context.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really important part of this to understand, because it doesn't make sense otherwise, even if you understand all of the details of the cases. And it's part of how this sense of a lack of resolution was really well situated. It also means that there were other sorts of, it doesn't necessarily mean this, but it also was coupled with the fact that there were other sorts of pressures, as you talked about in the beginning, with these sort of the city too busy to hate and all of those things, where, you know, it became a growing sense that there needed to be a Black perpetrator to affirm that narrative. And so all of those things conspired. They are things that people all of these years later continue to talk about, continue to use, and when they're describing their skepticism around Wayne Williams' conviction, and to frame a narrative, a variety of stories within the context of lingering trauma.
Yeah. There's a bunch of questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. There's a bunch of questions stacking up in the Q&A. So we're going to go to those in about a few minutes. Talking though about the lingering trauma, I'm going to ask two questions. First of all, most of us know the quote that something like journalism is the first draft of history, right? And I want to ask all three of you how you're thinking about how popular culture has reshaped or redelivered the information from that first draft, and why that's important. So I'm thinking here of Ludacris, I'm thinking of Outkast, I'm thinking, of course, of novels by Tayari Jones and Toni Cade Bambara, I'm thinking of a painting by Shaniqua Gay. How has popular culture reshaped and redelivered that first draft? Anybody?
I'll go for it. I think that what has happened with references to the Atlanta child murders in popular culture really indicates to the rest of the world that this notion of the beloved community, not just in Atlanta, but you know, there was this kind of idea that after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which promotes equal protection, due process under the law,
right?
Voting Rights Act of 1965. Which promotes voting. I mean, Black people could change their lives, and I think that by and large, for the most part, folks felt that everything had been removed out of the way in order for things to move forward. And Generation X, particularly with the references to popular culture, are letting you know, like, it didn't work that way. One of the reasons I've studied the Atlanta child murders is, just full disclosure, my father was offered a very high profile job at Morehouse School of Medicine in 1980. And he turned down the job because they were killing Black children in Atlanta and nothing was being done. And I can remember being on campus at Morehouse School of Medicine as a child with older brothers. And I just remember it being something odd. But I want to tell you why I'm saying this to you. When Outkast came out with their first album, they called Maynard Jackson crooked. They called him Crooked Maynard Jackson. And the interesting thing about it is it wasn't just about Maynard. That was about the whole king, the whole notion of like the beloved community and all these different things. And so the fact is that this is Dr. King's hometown, but Black children are being hunted and left in fields. And we're supposedly believing that we've moved forward. And then you have all that swept under the rug so that Atlanta could reach world-class status. I mean, I think it's just one of those things to where it's been left up to the scribes. It's been left up to the artists to really articulate, to help us remember in public and to give full understanding of it. I mean, I've seen some of the work that's been done on the Atlanta child murders most recently, and some of it has just been, super sensationalized. Whereas when those who can really move through Atlanta's Black communities, and there are numerous Atlanta Black communities, but when you can move through them, you have a very different disposition. And what I've always tried to do is I've always tried to paint the victims and their families. And I try to see their full humanity when I've written on
So thank you. So leaving it up to the artists, Vern, Calinda.
Well, so I think even there you have differences of how people talk about the crimes, right?
Sure.
So in Andre 3000's Bodies, he's referencing Wayne Williams. So but I think something like this is inevitably going to be embraced and dissected and revisited by artists because it was so traumatic. It did have such an impact on the communities and the people that these artists represent. That you know. And you know, these guys we're talking about, Ludacris, Andre 3000, they are experiencing it as children who are potential victims of the man, right? So I mean, my own daughters were of that same age at the time, and you know, my daughter says today that there are certain records that she hears from that period that's still discomforting to her. So the memories that you know, subconsciously stay with us that we think we may have buried because at the time we're operating on instinct because we're trying to get through the day. But you know, you find later on, like you just mentioned, Maurice, you know, your visit here in 1980 as a kid, you know, that's still there. And I think that's one of the reasons why this story is never going to go away, because now we have generations of people who weren't even born then, who have a take on what happened and have a response, have very concrete feelings about who did it and what it was all about to this day, you know. So it's one of those phenomenons that is destined to be rediscussed and really relived through succeeding generations. It's like an Emmett Till kind of experience for Black people, and that it gets passed down generationally. You know, you hear about it. People know people who actually were killed or who were friends of people that were killed. And, you know, it's like an itch that you can't really scratch.
So thank you. So Calinda, talk to us a little bit about the role of art in conveying this and in sharing this story.
I think that there is certainly the right, and quite frankly, in many ways, the responsibility of audiences, of artists to narrate in ways that are often more evocative than the work of scholars, and that represent different frameworks. And I think that that's particularly the case in some of the examples that were shared, right? We talk about Andre 3000's Bodies. We talk about, our friend Tiara Jones's book, Leaving Atlanta. These are their experiences, right? To my fellow panelists' point, these are their experiences. And they're writing out of that, and they certainly have the right to do so. But I also want to just be clear that I think that, particularly as somebody who lived through this, right? As somebody who, I remember being in the 3rd grade and afraid to sleep at night because I thought somebody was going to climb up to my 3rd floor window and take me out. I remember my parents having to stand on the bus stop with the children, which wasn't a thing that happened back then, y'all, and wait for the bus to come because somebody was out there snatching children. I remember all of those things that were happening contemporaneously that were terrifying. I remember a child who I went to summer camp with being one of the children who was killed. And that level of feeling of vulnerability. And I take exception to some of the artistic work that is being produced in the salacious nature of it, because I think that it is in some ways a response to the things that we've already discussed in this panel about the lack of care and disregard that was afforded the victims and their families. And so it makes sense that if care didn't have to be taken in 1980, about how we talked about these people,
right,
about how we represent their realities, about whether we even engage with them, about trying to narrate their realities. Why should we have to do it in 2022?
mm-hmm.
And I know that I certainly have, I've participated in some podcasts and some other kind, I've represented this in exhibition. And I also have refused a number of projects because they are salacious, mm-hmm. in my opinion. And I think that we have to be very careful and responsible to one another and accountable around that, because these are real people's lives and ongoing trauma and disregard. And what it also means in terms of, I think what Vern was saying about his daughter, for example, about how there are people who, and others, right? There are people who are talking about this and narrating this who didn't even personally live through it.
Right.
But we pass this along in particular ways. I live in Southeast Atlanta and moved back here with a 2-year-old, and now I have 2 sons. And my older son is 15 years old. He's a big boy. He's almost a man. And I don't like it when he walks more than 6 blocks away. And some of it has to do with ongoing, issues of violence and police brutality and all this. And some of it has absolutely to do with my rootedness in this experience, right, and us occupying that landscape. And I had to take him aside at one point in time and just cop to that. Doesn't change it, but he has to understand that that's the reality of that. Yeah. And I think so that's one of the ways that sort of this generational trauma, and it is also situated in a notion that we already talked about, which is that we have to be hypervigilant in taking care of our own. Right. And that also means that has to do with kind of being defensive about representations of our own.
And how that story is conveyed and who gets to convey it and how the information is passed on, right? So that it's real information or valid information. This kind of gets back to that. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and also even evokes the right sense. So for me, right, I do a lot of public history work. I do, I'm at the center, exhibitions is under my purview. When I was at the Atlanta History Center, we were doing an exhibition about the history of Atlanta, in which I insisted that this episode be included, interpreted. And people were kind of shocked. Some folks were even chagrined, like, why do we have to talk about that? Like,
doesn't that go back to our first question here?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Like, this is because it's formative, because it's pivotal, because it's critical. And so for many of the audiences that we purport to share, that we purport to, to serve. And so I remember that as we were looking through some photographs, one of the photographs that other members of this committee wanted to use to talk about the child murders, because they felt like it was iconic in their memory of this moment, was Maynard Jackson sitting behind his desk,
I remember,
with stacks and stacks of money as a reward for information leading to the arrest, right, and prosecution of whoever was responsible for these murders. And I am typically pretty reserved in professional settings. And I remember sort of losing my cool and saying, that's obscene. The iconic image for this moment in time is not this. It is not this mayor who in many ways there's so much pride around. And in other ways, there's so much disappointment around this issue in this moment, sitting in front of piles of money to make some statement about the nameless and faces in this iteration, victimization of children who had no money.
Yeah. And
so there's a real tension there. And I would argue that in some ways, right, the curatorial work is artistic work.
Yes.
And so that tension continues to exist.
Thank you. So on the subject of living through this, which is something you started talking about, what do you, and we've got a question in the chat about this too, what do each of you want us, your audience, your listeners, to know about the lasting trauma of having lived through this. Each of you had some kind of personal interaction with that era and these events. So what do you want us to know about the generational trauma, the lasting trauma? Somebody says, I think a good question, this is Destiny Redmond, says, I think a good question would be, how do we intervene on this generational trauma within our city with so many elements repressing the voices of those affected? So can you tie this together?
Well, I think we have to heal, and we have to acknowledge and heal. And I know that there have been several things taking place in the city to kind of acknowledge and, you know, do some different things. But we also have to get, we have to get into communities, and we have to do something that will leave a lasting legacy. I want to tell you all something really quickly. Just after the Atlanta Child Murder docuseries that debuted on HBO, I had come home one day from a bike ride, and I have a small child. I have a 6-year-old son, and during the time he would like to kind of go and hide in my house. And so he goes, and I don't know what's going on with this, but he goes and he hides behind some stuffed animals, and he goes to sleep. The thing about it is I got some threats from random people when I participated in the Atlanta Child Murder docuseries. I got death threats in some particular ways. And when we couldn't find him because he was dead asleep to the world behind behind these stuffed animals, I told my wife, I said, we have to call the police. And when I called the police, and, you know, after they kind of looked through the house, they were like, here he is, he's behind these stuffed animals and whatever, whatnot. When we walked outside, I felt like such a fool, but when we walked outside, I had to tell the police officer, I said, I have to tell you this. I said, I'm the consulting producer and chief historian for the Atlanta Child Murder docuseries, and I've had some threats. And I said, that is what was going on in my mind as I did this work. So what I'm getting at here is that we have to repair the communities, these families and the communities from which these children came from. We have to acknowledge that, you know, the thing about it is sometimes Atlanta gets praised for doing the bare minimum for Black people, but we really do have to make Atlanta, you know, the great city that it can be. And so we have to put our resources, and we have to acknowledge where things are so that we can heal and move forward.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Vern, yeah.
So, you know, this is kind of a perennial question for America and Black America, right? How do we get past the effects of the latest traumatic experience, the latest undeserved misfortune of Black people, right? So it's a very difficult question. You know, I mean, I came of age when I was a child when Emmett Till happened. You know, I'm not sure if I ever got over that, right? So this is an unfortunate part of you know, Black in America, right? You're always dealing with trauma. How do you dislodge the previous one before you can deal with the one that's in front of you?
Yeah. And I want to be clear that I didn't ask about getting over it, right? Because trauma is not a thing that a person puts behind that.
It's a very difficult question to wrestle with, because I don't know if you ever do. It's like trying to unring the bell. It's there. I think in the particulars of this case that we're talking about, it won't relieve the trauma, but if there were some answers to some of the lingering questions, who killed the two girls, right? Who killed the people, the victims that were not attributed to Wayne Williams.
To Williams, yeah.
So there are several ways that you could try to come at it, but I think maybe one way is to continue to discuss it and try to make sense of what happened, to try to hold up the survivors of the victims, you know, to let them know that we feel that the loss of their children is deeply felt by all of us, that their children were not valueless, you know, that the class thing should not separate our compassion and our concern for them. I think that by keeping the memory of this unfortunate period alive and trying to continue to wrestle with it, just may be the only thing that we as a community concretely have left as a way of trying to address some of this lingering trauma.
Thank you. Yeah, Calinda.
Now, I agree with everything that's been said, and I agree in particular that, you know, it isn't a question of getting over it, because you don't, right? Who can get over the senseless and violent death of a child? But I think that this work to acknowledge that it has never been over is a first and really important step, because it is so egregious. And I think somebody in the chat said an outrage, that we should be called upon to be over it. And I think that the other thing is to think about what's the injury. You know, as Vern said, you can't unring the bell, right? You're not bringing these children back. But what is the injury? Is the injury that our lives don't matter, and that we are not instituting policy and holding each other accountable to policy that makes our lives safe and valued and sacrosanct? Is it that the injury is that people who suffered this loss were vilified instead of embraced and soothed in whatever ways they could be? Those acknowledgements of what the injury is and a real attention to addressing those injuries, I think is an important, an essential way to honor those who were lost and to move forward in a way that's going to put us in a much better place.
In a much better place. Somebody in the comments said that's the role of history, is the way we move forward to a better place in time. We have about 3 minutes left, I think. How can that be? No, we've got more like 6. 2 things. Someone in the chat has asked, should we say their names? And that's one way to remember them. And someone else in the chat, Kelly Caudle, asks if y'all can talk about the recent efforts to reopen the case, reevaluate the DNA and that kind of thing. And I'm curious, is that a re-injury or not? Reopening the case.
You know, there's 40 years. So the thing about it is the defense attorneys have information that the city doesn't have. So the city is reopening the case based on what they used, and the defense attorneys have 40 years worth of evidence. And I'm telling you all, it is eye-opening. And it will get to the bottom of what happened. I will say it like that. But, you know, there have been times where I thought about writing a full-scale book on the Atlanta child murders, but it's heavy. It's extremely heavy kind of work. And another thing about it too is I'm built to do that work. But the thing about it is, spiritually, what do you take on when you do that? Because from how I see it as a trained historian, I see doing good history as being spiritual work. You have to be able to kind of move about and feel and articulate and then write it in particular ways. But the thing about it is, if we want to get some kind of semblance of what really happened, the case needs to be reopened. Will it trigger emotions and trauma? Absolutely. And Black people have been dealing with that since the first Africans showed up in 1526. So, you know, it's one of those things to where I don't know how to answer that question, but if on one level, yes, on the other level, no. So it's yeah. I can sit on the fence for it.
I don't think it's an easy question.
No, and I think, you know, new evidence will provide another area of more contentious discussion, right? On the one hand, there is the unsatisfaction of not knowing, right? Of wanting to satisfy your own questions about what really happened or what else happened.
Right.
And how does what we know after a conviction in the case, how does it square with what happened that led up to the conviction in the case? So I think in many ways, the more new information we bring to it, the more the more questions will arise, right? It's like it's one of those things where you will never satisfy that curiosity, I think, that we all have, that would make us feel certain that Wayne Williams was in fact guilty of some of these cases, or Wayne Williams was an innocent victim of circumstance, and that there are, and we do know at any rate right now that there are people who were involved in some murders that never were brought to the bar of justice. So if you're looking for like a finite answer to, can justice be done in these cases? I despair that we may ever get to that point.
Calinda?
I would further share that I think if we really are honest with ourselves, we know that if we were to learn beyond the shadow of a doubt that Wayne Williams was responsible for it all and right where he should be, or if we were to learn beyond the shadow of a doubt that it was Joe Blow and Joe Blow went to prison forever, we would not feel a sense of true satisfaction and resolution and peace with what happened here in Atlanta. And so with that part in mind, I think that memorialization and commemoration are essential parts of the healing.
Yeah. On that subject, somebody, Sue Ross, put something in the chat of which I was not aware, which is that there's a permanent memorial to the missing and murdered children being constructed at City Hall, spearheaded by former Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, who grew up during that period. I'm seeing enthusiastic nods from the panelists. Do you want to take us home with comments on that? We've got about 3 minutes left.
Well, first and foremost, Sue Ross is like one of the greatest photographers in all of Atlanta's history in the world. Like, and so, but no, I think that's a noble gesture that was done by the Honorable Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, who knew and understood, who knew some of the victims, but also, carried the city carried that pain of the city with her as she was mayor of Atlanta. Mm-hmm. I think that's a seriously noble gesture that the mayor did.
Yeah,
yeah, I agree.
It's a wonderful beginning.
Terrific. I agree, and I'm very glad that we are concluding on a note of memorialization and memory and a new beginning, to take that term. I have that it's about 2:14, so I'm going to welcome Joe Davich back to our screen. I want to thank our panelists, Vern Smith, Maurice Hobson, Calinda Lee, for a really insightful, thought-provoking, and generous conversation. Joe, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you to all of our panelists, Vern, Maurice, and Calinda. This was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Just to let you all know, we do have a winner for our raffle. We will be notifying you shortly afterwards, and you can work on getting your prizes next week. I would like to remind you that at 4 o'clock, our panel is going to be on Tony Cade Bambara, who of course wrote the book, These Bones Are Not My Child. Toni Morrison called this work a magnum opus that puts the reader at the heart of the horror that became to be called the Atlanta child murders. So we hope you will join us at 4 o'clock where we will continue this discussion, not only of the Atlanta child murders, but of the wonderful work that Tony K. Bambaro contributed to Georgia's literary heritage. We had folks from 12 states, including Georgia, in addition to our guests from West Sussex, Lake Lugano, Italy, and the University of Leicester. So thank you all in Europe for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at 4 p.m. and throughout the rest of the weekend for Revival Lost Southern Voices 2022. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all so much.